shut it down a little bit.
Very retro color.
It is nice, isn't it? Like a camel.
It's kind of like a Grinch green.
Thanks for the association. So we had a few attendants last week.
This weekend.
Last week. Oh, she did.
Do we have a sign or anything down there that lets folks know to come up, or
No, there wasn't.
is it pretty?
Yeah, I don't know how we're indicating that. Let me jump down there, Mayor, if you guys want to get started.
Okay. Just want to make sure, as we are going, people just know that we've moved.
There was that sign down.
It's sad to see him leave, would he? Yeah.
Portable ones, it's like a 10. It's like
Oh.
4 pieces.
Yeah.
Collapses. It was like my mom always forgets hers. Like half the time. It's nice. Have a spare at the house.
Boy, this weather's pretty nice for January.
Today's nice. Stock show's over, right?
No,
As soon as
it goes
the stock
through
show-
Sunday.
Oh, it goes to Sunday. Usually stock
We have
show
tickets on
time is
Saturday.
coldest.
Yeah.
I'll just wait for
Careful,
it to
yeah.
get
Let me see if she's back. Did you guys see the stock show guys skiing today?
Yeah,
That was awesome.
it's always
What was
fun.
it?
They had a lot of the contestants from the stock show.
Oh.
with our town board work session for Monday, January 20th. Goal of the work session is to have the town board receive information on topics of town business from town manager, town attorney, and town staff, and any others that we may call and request to come forward in order to exchange ideas and opinions regarding these topics. Members of the public in attendance are asked to be recognized before participating, and usually in a work session, members in the audience are not invited to participate, but we will just kind of gauge this as we move along. So our first item this evening under the agenda is a land use code update, and we're going to have a presentation from Mr. Hornbeck. So, Mr. Hornbeck.
Thank you and good evening. So when we last met on the land use code update in November, we talked over the subdivision standards. The parks and trails component of that, there were a few items of discussion and some direction from the town board, planning commission. So a few minor changes have been made just to bring those to your attention before we bring the full ordinance for consideration to you. One is the pocket park size, and again, the pocket park is the smaller neighborhood scale park that the developer would be responsible for constructing, and maintenance would be the responsibility of an HOA or a metro district. So we increased the size of those from 10,000 to 20,000 square feet, which is approximately a half acre size. Just the 10,000 was a little too small to really provide the amenities and really a benefit to the neighborhood. So we did bump that up, and that was also based on input from the Parks Department and their consultant on a minimum size. The other item on the pocket parks is just additional flexibility in the programming and design. So it's leaving it a little bit more open-ended, so it's not as rigid of certain requirements. And a related item is neighborhood trails that connect to pocket parks, as well as to school sites, other trails, things like that. We've, I think, solidified the requirements for that to provide those trails. And they'd be similar to the pocket parks owned and maintained by a HOA or Metro District.
So I have a question, and just for clarification. Neighborhood trails to connect park sites, schools, town trails, and other amenities. So who carries the cost, the financial cost for the build-out? And then who carries the cost for O&M after that?
So initial construction would be the developer's obligation, and then maintenance would be by Metro District or HOA.
Mayor,
Yes.
are we
Mr. Sosnowski.
going to question?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Did we run this by the developer community for feedback or thoughts on, I assume this is somewhat of a shift in terms of cost responsibility, at least
Yeah.
on the O&M side.
Yes, the draft subdivision standards were shared with the development community.
And if I imagine two neighborhoods next to each other, who is it that makes sure that the connecting trail connects as you cross from one neighborhood to the next? Do we have a master path that says when you build out, the path should go here, and the next neighborhood starts there?
So we only have a master plan for town trails. The neighborhood level trails would be more as development occurs, is coordinating between developments.
Did you have something?
No, were you done with that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Along the same line, though, if I could, if
Yes.
I may. Part of our design and community has had trail connectivity, so I want to see if I understand Mr. Solosky's question. Development A has trails within it. Development B comes in, we don't have a requirement that those trails connect somehow? Or do
No,
we?
there is a requirement for cross-connection between the
is?
developments.
Okay.
There's, what there isn't is an overall master plan, just because it's, our trails master plan for town trails generally follow roads or
Right.
drainages, rivers, things
Right.
like that. When you get into the smaller neighborhood scale, it's, I think, difficult for the town to dictate where trails are gonna go. It's
Sure.
more the development layout and where there are opportunities for trails. So it would be a kind of evolving as developments come in.
Wouldn't it be possible, though, if I was,
And Mr. Ballstat was also mentioning the, part of this concept is connecting to the regional parks, since the town is moving towards that direction of fewer but larger parks and having trails to those.
so I'm just putting this up there pretty concretely in my head. If I was a developer and I'm developing a piece of land, how would I know where to align my trails within my development so that it would connect to either the town trail or the next adjacent development? Is there some way I would know that? Or be able to plan for that? Or get some direction for that?
Yeah, I'm not sure if there's a good kind of predetermined location. It's going to be site by site and where there's opportunities for trail
Might be
corridors.
difficult is what you're saying, to do that.
Well, I think, again, if you can
Yeah.
just picture, so you have a development and they have their trail connections that go out. When the next developer comes in, as far as the land use types, you know, where the housing is gonna go, where their amenities are gonna go, there's no way for staff or anybody to really foresee until they come in with the development, and then we say, well, we have a requirement that you need to have this interconnectivity. So they could kind of design around that, but it's harder, I think, we can't get any further than that. You know, there's no way for us to master plan what a developer will do.
Right, because we don't know.
That's right.
But we could have a requirement that says the next development needs to connect somehow to existing town trail or other development trails.
Yes.
That's not in our code though, is it?
It's not in current code, no.
That was the point that you had asked for.
Yeah.
Okay, okay.
Sorry.
You need some clarification?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, because I think we're both poking at the same thing, and it just feels to me like if in fact we had a master plan, including the neighborhood connectivity to larger trails and to regional parks, and we really had that sketched out, now a developer looking at a piece of land would say, okay, I know I could put houses here and here and here, but oh, I need to honor that trail.
Exactly.
And on an exception basis, say, well, can I put it somewhere other than this master plan? So that feels more organized to me, to kind of have it planned out ahead instead of just wing it as it's developed.
Well, and I know, Dr. Jones, you have a question too, but along those very lines, how are we going to define amenities and how, within what flexibility are we even going to give developers? Because if we say they have to build out to every single amenity and every single trail, I know that can be quite costly. Because right now we service a lot of the Poudre River Trail, and I know our service fee has gone from $10,000 a year to over $100,000 a year. So within a neighborhood or a developer, I'm not sure, and then we're always talking about affordable housing. And we know that if we put these costs and these onus on a developer, it will be passed along either through a metro district, which we also are getting a lot more concerns and questions about. So is there going to be some level of reasonableness or flexibility, or is it just going to be, if there's some kind of amenity, however we're going to define that, or some kind of a park or school, that's an absolute that there has to be, or is there some overall other guidance that will dictate?
Yeah, and I apologize. I think the word amenity on the slide and in the memo is, I don't think that's in the code language where it's not open-ended. It is schools, parks, other trails, those things. So I think it is fairly well defined. And was there another part of that question I didn't?
Well, just about some flexibility. I mean, because if those things are all kind of like coming together, or there's lots of them, is there ever any flexibility or a choice at all? Or is it just a have to, no matter what the cost, no matter if it feels, I don't know. Because it's hard to say because we don't know what somebody might be bringing to us in the future or what that's going to look like.
I think what we heard from the last work session was town board wanted to ensure that there were neighborhood connections to parks was the primary thing that I took from that. If we want to scale it back and not address schools or other things, we could do that. I think it is a fairly open-ended in terms of it's not a hard requirement of certain miles of trails or anything like that. It's if you have a school, you have a park, you provide a path to it. So that's what we were going for.
Well, Board, I just want to kind of clarify too, these are all internal to the development. These are not any offsite improvements. So to the extent that there's a trail to a school, it would be a school that's planned for this neighborhood. To the extent that there's a trail to the park, it's a park for this neighborhood. So this is contained inside of the boundaries of the development. I think it would be a bit absurd to say, well, you need to connect up to Grandview Elementary and that's a mile down 13. I mean, it's just, these are just improvements actually in the development. So you understand how it would be contained that way.
Okay. Dr. Jones and then Mr. Baker.
Yeah, Paul, are you going to cover these other things as well? You had a couple review process, and
Yes, I'll get to
I have
those.
a question on like each item, but I can ask the one on the park situation now if you want.
Sure.
I guess the only thing that concerns me about this is the owned and maintained. Metro District, that doesn't concern me. HOA does. Because the developer finishes his project, he turns the neighborhood over to an HOA. HOAs come and go. There's nothing, to keep them, if they dissolve, and we put this park maintenance on their shoulders, what do we come back to? I think a Metro District is pretty well bound to do it, but I don't think an HOA necessarily would.
Yeah, I don't disagree that I think we've all seen HOAs that can run into problems with maintenance or things. I guess our thought process was not requiring a Metro District with a development, if they wanted to, if they didn't want to use a metro district, then they could use the HOA, but I think we agree the metro district's maybe the safest and best way to,
Yeah, I'd almost predict a number of these, if we get a number of these going, that the town will be taking over some of them when the HOA fails.
So with that, then I would say we need even more flexibility because that would be additional costs coming to us in the future. Mr. Baker?
Thank you. I think this stems from the fact that we were having less neighborhood parks and bigger parks that were spread out, where we wanted the connectivity to make sure that people that didn't get their park had easy access to the next park. So, but my question is, how does this deviate from our current situation? I think in my neighborhood, we have a park, it's beautiful. We don't have a trail to the park, we have sidewalks.
Right.
I mean, we're already requiring the sidewalks, so I like trails, I love trails. I'm not sure this is gonna be a huge burden if people are just, the developers putting in sidewalks anyway, so.
so it is going beyond a sidewalk. It's requiring a trail in a green belt that's, you know, off the street.
To get to the park?
To get to the park, yeah.
Okay.
So it would, I guess it's, yeah, it's above and beyond a sidewalk.
But then to Miles' point, then I would be even more concerned, because then that's when we really do need some reasonableness, because if people have sidewalks to get there, why would we mandate to a developer that on top of that, they have to build another trail someplace else? Unless there's some place in that area where there's not the ability to, you know, connect, to have that connection. But if there's that connection coming from, as he said, the sidewalks, I'm not sure why we want to double up on. It doesn't increase the cost for anybody, but the homeowner in that neighborhood at the end of the day.
I agree with the point that the mayor made about flexibility. The developer has to have a lot of flexibility depending on the geography and the roadways and all those kind of things. My main point is that we talk about connectivity, and we should not be into micromanagement of how that's done. But I want to make certain that there's a way to get from neighborhood A to neighborhood B to downtown, and perhaps just, we have the transportation master plan. We have a draft of that, and we'll have a final in a month or so. Requiring a developer to look at that and see where town trails are so that they could plan in a way that we do have maximum connectivity, however that works for them.
Anything else on that, so we can get off the first slide? Sorry, but I think these are important things, because I don't know that, I mean, from what I'm hearing, that as this is laid out here, I think this needs some work. But we'll let you move on to the next slide.
I did have another question.
Okay, go ahead.
Regarding the pocket parks, okay. I understand the concept. And these would be owned and maintained by either the Metro District or HOA. Do we have any, again, I know we gave examples of what those could be, so there's flexibility. Do we have any standards about the quality of what those are? Just in case in the future the town had to take those over. Are they ADA compatible? Are they inclusive? You know, do we have any standards associated with what would be placed in a pocket park?
So the idea is to provide essentially a list of the types of amenities they could provide, and they choose from that. I think things like ADA, we can, I think they would want to make it ADA, or they'd be liable if they didn't, but we can ensure that that's in the code as well.
Okay? Are we ready to go on? Okay.
Slide two.
Slide two.
So the next item we talked about last meeting in November was the review body on different land use applications. So as a reminder, there's certain legislative actions like annexations and rezonings that town board is required to be the review body on. So there's no changes contemplated on those. And the consensus last meeting was to leave conditional use grants as town board action items. So there's really left with preliminary and final subdivision plats and site plans for multifamily as the two applications that we could modify those processes. There's two primary benefits we've identified with changes of this nature, and one is providing a streamlined process that has a reduced number of meetings required. This can save applicants time and money and also allow staff greater efficiency of time and resources. The other primary benefit is just providing greater certainty to all involved in the process. There's often a public perception that town board has more authority on land use applications than the code actually allows. For quasi-judicial applications, as you're aware, they need to be reviewed on the merit of their application for conformance with the code. And public hearings tend to allow for evidence that are not relevant to the project's merit. So the table is showing preliminary plat on the top, looking at other jurisdictions, and preliminary plat is generally left with Planning Commission in the region, the exception being Loveland, who has the most streamlined process, and that's just left with the planning director. The final plat is generally done with the planning director in the region, with Windsor kind of being an outlier of having that go to town board. It'd be a similar situation with the multifamily site plan of Windsor being a bit of an outlier with the town board requiring to take the action as opposed to planning director for most jurisdictions. And what's provided here is a flow chart trying to illustrate existing process on a major subdivision versus what's proposed. The primary thing we're doing is taking Planning Commission, the first meeting is currently not a public hearing. We would make that a public hearing. That gets public involvement, excuse me, earlier in the process. We would also, the thought process is the Planning Commission would approve preliminary. The final plat would be left to planning director or planning staff, and that would be reviewed for conformance with the preliminary plat. So if it's in conformance, there wouldn't be a need to bring it back for additional hearings. There would be in order to take on right-of-way, there would be a separate meeting for that, which could kind of be separated from the actual subdivision review, but town board could accept right-of-way by dedication. All in all, there's potential to save about 6 weeks for an applicant through these changes. So back to the multifamily site plan, there was discussion about if we change that to more of an administrative review, what kind of public notice, how's the public made aware of the project? So we looked at, again, neighboring jurisdictions, and this is for most all application types in the chart, just for comparison's sake, but looking at site plan, currently we don't have any notification, but there is the public meeting. Fort Collins has 800 to 1,000 foot radius for notice. Greeley does not have any. Longmont has a 300 foot radius. And Loveland, for most uses and zones, does not have a notification. In certain situations, it's 300. Let's see. So other changes would be requiring notification for master plan, which is not currently required. Increasing the conditional use grant notification from 100 feet to 300 feet. And that's for everything except oil and gas. It's currently 500 and we propose to leave it at 500. So the 100 foot is really, it's really small. It's maybe one adjacent property, so increasing it to 300. We would begin mailing public notices for variances, which we don't currently do. We think neighbors need to be aware if there's a variance setback coming closer to their house, something like that. As I mentioned, the preliminary plat would be a public hearing with notice for that. So that's kind of a lot of information. So any questions on all that before I move on to the last part.
Okay, Mr. Baker?
Yeah. I have a comment on the rezone notice requirement. 300 seems pretty small to me. To me, a rezone is it is a big deal, I think, if someone's changing the zoning next year to your neighborhood. So I would prefer that to be a little bit higher. And then in regards to the previous slide about the multifamily, the town board, when we review a site plan, we really can't say no, right? If they've gone through the proper channels, they've done the proper work, it comes to us and there's really not much we can do at that point, correct?
Well, we're reviewing it for conformance with the code. If they are proposing a building that's 100 feet and it's only allowed to be 35, then, as an example,
But that would have got caught way before it came to us, is my thought.
yes, if they refuse to make that adjustment, then it maybe would come to town board.
Okay.
Um,
But a rezone for multifamily would come to town board because it's a rezone.
Correct, yeah, and that's, I think, a good point is the zoning really sets the uses for the property, and that's kind of the bigger discussion item for town board.
Okay. Thank you.
Anybody else? Dr. Jones?
Yeah, I guess following up a little on Miles' comments, I have no problem believing that staff is going to follow all the codes where they need to be followed, but I'm just feel a town board should be kept apprised somehow, not necessarily hold any of these hearings, but at least know what's going on. So when somebody comes to you and a citizen says, what's going on the south side of this town, and you don't say, huh? I mean, just so we're aware, how would you envision us being kept apprised in a timely manner of what's being reviewed and where it stands?
So for the multifamily site plan, we could replicate the process we use for commercial industrial site plans where it's a communications item in your packet. For the plating, we could do something similar. Greeley, for instance, I believe it's Greeley. They provide a written report to Planning Commission, but we could do it to Planning Commission and Town Board. So a similar idea of just reporting these projects to you.
Okay, and as far as the notification distances, it looks like we're at the bottom end, in every category compared to the surrounding towns. Do you think maybe those distances should be increased somewhat?
I think the rezoning was a good point. I don't necessarily see a harm in increasing it. We don't want to go too far out and people are not interested but yeah, we can look at trying to be more.
300 feet doesn't seem very far, really, when you think about it.
Yeah, we can look at being more consistent with neighbors on that one.
Anybody else? Mr. Kozlowski?
I'm curious, on the graph you have there now on the conditional use, at least for Windsor, you had specified specifically oil and gas. Are the other jurisdictions you list here simply don't have a separate requirement for oil and gas, or because you don't show it on the table?
Yeah, I guess I'm not familiar enough with all their processes to say. Some are. Yeah.
And I think I will echo Mr. Baker's comment. I think the issues that we've seen when you're rezoning touch a broader neighborhood, adjacent neighborhood that may even be further than 300 feet away, but will impact them in some way. So I think to be fair, to give them an opportunity to be heard, probably broadening that would make sense.
Anything else?
so-
So, did you have any questions? So, I just want to make sure that in the land use application review, that does not include any CUGs. That process would remain the same?
Correct, yeah.
Okay. And Well, I appreciate the chart that shows all of our fellow communities. I think that one thing that we've always done is, you know, I think Windsor is a champion of its own. And so I don't know that we necessarily, I mean, we can look to those as guidance, but I think too, what is really right for us, and not necessarily, because what's right for us is not always necessarily what is right or works in our communities. And I would echo Doc Jones, because if the recommendation here is to take this and completely, I mean, you're gonna leave one with the planning commission, but the other two will go with the planning director. I do know that there have been, not a lot, but there have been about a half dozen in the 10 years, instances that I've been on the town board, where one of these have come before us, even after it's gone through planning, and this board has then decided that we wanted something either less restrictive or more restrictive or something different and changed. And I'm not sure that, with all due respect to our planning director, that voice or that that kind of thought process would occur there. So I would agree that we need to still have, I don't want to be in, you know, deep in the weeds with this. And I certainly like the aspect about reduced meetings and, you know, reducing the time for these folks to go through the process. But I think that this board and future boards should have some mechanism where they stay in the loop in some shape or form.
Sure, and I just wanted to, I guess, remind the town board that when this code update started quite a while ago, it was really at the request of the development community to try and streamline and achieve some sort of, I guess, parity with our neighboring jurisdictions. And so it wasn't at all a, I guess, a ploy of staff to try and create more administrative approvals and take anything from the town, off the town board's plate. It was really to, particularly Loveland and the Brands project, brought in the whole competition between us and our neighbors and that into the conversation. And that's why we were proposing a lot of these administrative approvals. And I completely agree with the comments about the rezoning and the annexation. Those are obviously statutory requirements that need to be maintained and maybe beefed up. But it's those other applications that are maybe site plans or preliminary approvals that having a hearing where there really isn't a lot of opportunity for change or for impacting change is somewhat of a hollow hearing that we don't want to give the public the impression that they're going to be able to make a lot of change in those specific applications. Really, the zoning is where we need the most public input, because that sets, as Paul said, all of the allowed uses by right. So
let's do this, because I have heard the board, and I think that certainly as staff, we should talk and really have a good communications plan for the board. So before we make these changes, if it'd be okay with you, let us talk about how we could update you, what that would look like, and kind of give you some examples, because, you know, I think we want to have the same thing here. And I'm thinking certainly when it goes to Planning Commission, we have that preliminary plat. I think it's a really good opportunity for us to give that to the board in communication, say, P&Z just approved this, here it is, you know, give you the same chance to look at it. And then following that, I think if there's just some minor code revisions and it really no variances to the code, it's just them following through, I think we could update as we go, but you'd be pretty familiar with what's going to happen based on the preliminary plat. But let us work through that and make sure you're comfortable on how this would go, and you're not succeeding any responsibilities of the board by doing this.
Okay. Mayor Pro Tem Bennett?
You kind of addressed what I was going to say. We have several objectives here. One is to certainly streamline the process for some good reasons. Also, I agree with what Dr. Jones said. As an elected official, I feel responsibility to be able to answer a constituent when they say what's going on in here. And the mayor made a point too, there have been times when we have reviewed sites and made some changes to that. So I'm trying to figure out how to balance all that. So perhaps, and this may be what Mr. Hill was getting to, if we have notification in our packets of plats, site plans, then it falls on me and the rest of us to do our homework and read those. And so perhaps there could be a process where if we see something that looks not maybe acceptable to the community, we would have a way to raise that and bring it to the board, but not every single case. So I don't know if that's possible or not. With some
Well,
flexibility.
I think it'd be similar to the site plan, and again, we still need to talk, but I think if you're presented with preliminary plat that the planning and zoning has approved, it's on communications, you've looked at it, and you said, geez, I'm not really sure if I like the idea of a convenience store here. I think you could still kind of filter those through staff early enough to where we could, at least meet with them and say, hey, they're having some concerns about that. So I'm envisioning something similar. It just wouldn't be that real public hearing approval process where, again, that you're not really given a lot of discretion to change a whole lot in there anyway. So
Right.
Yeah, right, I think that's,
Yeah. That would be done, my understanding is what I'm hearing now, the recommendation is to do that with the planning commission, and I'm fine with that. So I think what we need is something, a bit of a hybrid to
Right,
what's being
right.
recommended right now, with some additions. And I do know we have some folks from the planning commission here this evening, so I don't know, I mean, I would entertain and allow if you had something to add to this, because they certainly deal with looking at these things even more so than this board. So if you have anything to add to this, or would like to add anything to this conversation, come forward or raise your hand, and we certainly would like to hear from our planning commission as well, if they would like to add to this. But anybody else? Oh, Mr. Sosowski.
Thank you, Mayor. And I think what this feels right, I like the idea of streamlining it, of making it flow. One of the concerns I think we're all sharing, because currently we do the use by right, where certain things are added to a board packet, and I find it difficult to review those with any meaningful way. I look at it, but the kind of conversation and input we've had where we have a review at the board is so much more meaningful for me. I'm almost viewing it in the abstract when I see it as an appendix to our packet. Not to say I'd want to see that in every situation, but what we've talked about is where we can raise an issue and ask for the board for full consideration. But I'm wondering if we should give the applicant the opportunity. So as long as everyone is in agreement through the process, maybe we just see it as part of our packet. But if the applicant says, I can't reach agreement, they have a right to appeal to the full board as well, so we can discuss it more openly.
Okay, Mr. McCarter.
So I've been thinking about this while we were talking about it, but also before, and that is, I don't want the town board to have too much information about something that will come before you as a quasi-judicial matter. So, to say, well, we want to know about things, and then if we have a problem, then it comes before us, but at that point, haven't you already made up your minds? And that's the concern I've got, is we need to protect the integrity of the quasi-judicial process. So when it comes to quasi-judicial, I'm not as comfortable with you knowing a lot
Right.
until you get to a public hearing. And if what you say is, there are certain things that we don't want to let go of, then okay, we can do that. But those that you do let go of, I'm uncomfortable giving you somehow the ability to say, wait, I don't like how this is going, I want it to come before us. And if it's quasi-judicial, I think just by the very nature of it, you've got more information than you might probably should have.
It's kind of a pickle, isn't it? You're either waiving your quasi-judicial process by having advance information.
But I think what Paul is suggesting is that there are certain areas where the quasi-judicial process, the amount of stuff that you can do in that setting is so limited.
Right.
And yet we have hours and hours of public hearing on stuff that to some residents may feel relevant, but when you look at the criteria that you're applying, it doesn't fit. And so I think that's some of it too, is that what Paul is trying to say is we should reserve public hearings for the stuff that actually gives you some discretion on the criteria, and in those cases, make certain that the evidence is focused on the criteria. And that's often difficult because folks feel strongly about these things.
But that's identified in the early process, whether it's going to be quasi-judicial.
Sure, yeah.
So I think that could easily be handled, because if it's quasi-judicial, and if whatever information, limited information we might get, if it's prefaced with this is a quasi-judicial, I think the understanding would be, this is all you get to know, because it is formulated, it's coming through that process.
If it has a chance of coming before you, the less you know, I'm afraid.
Right, right,
better.
yeah, absolutely. Okay. Anything else? Then continue.
Where'd we end up?
So, last part is just a few miscellaneous items that we'd like to get updated. The code currently fails to address parking of vehicles in a front yard, on a lawn, or creation of graveling of the whole front yard. We periodically receive complaints of someone parking, on their lawn or something similar to that. So we do have a proposed code language to address that really says you need to be parking on an approved surface, which would be generally concrete or asphalt for the primary parking area. You could do a supplemental parking that could be gravel adjacent to a driveway. So your required parking would need to be on that paved surface. If you're wanting to have extra parking, you could do it on that gravel surface adjacent to your driveway. So that's that portion of it. So if there's any questions or comments.
So how would that be noticed? By the simple issuance of complaints?
Yeah, it would be a complaint driven, like most of our code enforcement, it's complaint based. It's not something we proactively go out and look for.
Any questions? About that?
Sounds good.
Okay.
So then the last piece is central business downtown area currently allows automobile sales and servicing, which is somewhat inconsistent with the vision for downtown as a more pedestrian and retail-oriented environment. And there's been some recent reuse of properties such as the Dutch Bros site, which was previously the car sales, as well as the relocation of Pike's Auto outside the CB district. So we see now as an opportune time to amend the CB district to remove auto sales, rentals, and service as allowed uses. And so that's that update.
Were they allowed under the original codes, or did they require variance?
No, I believe they were allowed when they
were
went in,
allowed.
yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Anything else? Okay.
Thank you.
So, Board, if I could have a minute to just recap, because I've been taking notes, and sometimes a couple of you speak, and I'm not sure if it's really the voice of the board or just a couple of people speaking. So I'm going to recap kind of my notes, and you let me know if I've missed anything or if we've got it wrong before we bring this back to you. So one is, I think, you guys had a concern with the trails if it's serviced by sidewalks. So if the sidewalk services a park, does it really need a trail? So I think maybe we can work on language that either defines the width of a sidewalk, what would service or a trail. So for example, if it has a 3-foot sidewalk, maybe that's not adequate to touch these places, but an 8-foot sidewalk may. So we can look and maybe just have that language addressed where it's not serviced by a sidewalk, then a trail could be required. That seems like a place we could maybe go. The other notes I have is a few of you said maybe increasing the notice area for the rezoning. We didn't talk about distance. I don't know if 500 feet seems more reasonable or 1,000 feet, but it seemed like at least quite a few of you wanted us to increase the amount of area that we notice. So if I don't hear different, I think that that'll probably come back as maybe a 500-foot requirement unless I hear different.
You're talking about the rezoning?
Rezoning.
Yes.
Yes.
And we can look at the other things, but I think that Mr. Hornbeck is right in kind of what Mr. Baker said. Rezoning is a pretty insidious, it can bring a lot of neighbors out, so we may want to increase that scope.
Yeah, I would say 500. I would even agree to higher than 500 on that. I don't know, rezone feels like it's a big deal to me, so.
I think it should be at least what oil and gas is, let's say at the 500.
Okay. So we'll probably bring it back at 500, and then if the board says, never mind, kick it to 1,000, you can do that. And then the final thing is really figuring out how we can best communicate with the board if you are gonna let planning and zoning and then the planning director do these approvals, just how we can loop the board in, considering his quasi-judicial concerns and how that process would look, so we can work on that. So is there anything we missed, anything else that we need to cover before we bring this back?
How about the maintenance of the parks? Is there any way we can tweak that?
Oh, yeah, with the HOA versus metro districts. It is kind of a pickle, like Mr. Hornbeck said, given it, a lot of the feedback we've had on metro districts, that the town doesn't really want to require and mandate that they're put in. I think if a developer wants to come in without a metro district, we should certainly allow that. But you're right, if it's an HOA, what teeth do we have to ensure that maintenance? So, I don't know that we're gonna have a better answer for you. Dr. Jones, I think it's just either we don't do that or, yeah, it just needs to be a board discussion. Because I think either way, it's going to be a hard policy decision for the board. Either to allow both and know that HOAs may not get it done, or require metro districts, but then that's where we're going.
I think, Shane, and one other element that kind of brought up, bounced around, was really what these parks and access and other things look like. And I think the mayor voiced some concern about how big or how complex. But it feels to me, I think normally a process for some design is that the town would have oversight in terms of what it is that's being put in. And they'd have to more or less build to the spec that's mandated by the town. One of your bullet points on your slide said that there was increased flexibility in terms of pocket parks. And I think that's part of the answer, is to probably give the town flexibility to agree on a large or small park depending on the neighborhood. But then similarly, once decided that they have to build to our spec, that would cover the ADA concerns or other issues, since we would have at least a role in saying what it looks like. But I certainly share Dr. Jones' idea, concern too on the HOAs. But yeah, I think you got it.
Mr. Reynolds?
I just wanted to ask, how many pocket parks do we have right now? Because I didn't realize that we went from pocket parks. I thought we were going to shift more to the community park structure. I'm picturing the park that the town built in our neighborhood, but the town maintains it. Completely. There are other sidewalks within, community sidewalks within the neighborhood on easement, over ditches, stuff like that, that the neighborhood does take care of. And I'm in an HOA, and the HOA does maintain that, but the actual park, it's a neighborhood park. It's not a pocket park. It's not a 10 to 20,000 square foot park. I guess I'm just coming back to, is this where we're headed? And that's why Parks and Rec wants this to be on the HOA or Metro District to take care of. The pocket park idea, I guess, seems out of left field, because I thought we were moving from neighborhood parks to more of the community parks going forward. So do we already have pocket parks, and that's why this is meant to fix that? Or is this where staff was presenting to the town board where they were wanting to go?
Yeah, I think the latter, and this conversation happened right before I started, but I believe the shift, so certainly with the community parks, that is where the town's trying to go. So we were on the hook to build still a couple more neighborhood parks that had been approved before we changed that policy.
Right.
But now the town's focus is community parks. But it may be a large enough neighborhood to where the nearest community park is still pretty far. So I think it's just gonna have that allowance of allowing those little pocket parks. It really wouldn't be a neighborhood park, but it would be some grass and in some area for that neighborhood to gather. They just get some grass under their toes.
So when it initially goes in, is it paid for by the developer?
Yes.
What? Okay.
And it would be to the developer's discretion whether they even wanted to put that in. Right?
Yeah, do we have, did we standardize
Or are we going to
that?
still require that?
It would be required based on the size of the neighborhood, how many units they're putting in. The type of amenities would be more up to them. That's where they have a list of things to choose from.
I guess I would have thought that this is where the staff would have told them, this has got some, quite some proximity to the nearest community park, et cetera. And so therefore you need to put one in, that it's not up to the developer's discretion, where then we get into a...
No, I think the discretion are the improvements that are on it, not necessarily the requirement to have the park. So like Mr. Hornbeck says, I think it's based on the number of lots, right? So depending on how big it is would dictate the size and square footage. But I don't think we're gonna dictate, you need one slide and one teeter-totter or whatever that is. I think that they have more discretion as far as what amenities, what they wanna put into that park.
But then we're really not moving away from neighborhood parks if we're still going to be dictating to a developer that they still, depending on the size, gonna have to be putting something in.
So I guess part of what we discussed at the last work session was the fact that our neighborhood might be one of the last ones to have a neighborhood park like that. And so going forward, if you have a neighborhood of a certain size and you don't have any of those local amenities, then we want to make sure that people have an opportunity to congregate for, I guess, like a national night out. If that neighborhood doesn't have some park space, and we're moving towards smaller lot sizes where people don't have as much of a backyard as they might have in the past, this would give them at least some area to throw the frisbee with the dog or something like that. It might not be as amenitized as one of the town neighborhood parks, but it would still make sure that neighborhoods of a certain size would have that open space and area for things like the neighborhood night out and that kind of thing.
Okay, Mr. Bennett?
Has it come up from the development community? I think the word park might be misleading. I'm just curious if any developers have said, if I'm required to put in a pocket park, am I still required to pay park improvement fees? I don't know if that's come up or not. Could these pocket parks be called something else? Could it just be open space? And if the developer wants to put amenities in, they could. If the intent is a gathering place for the neighborhood, I'm trying to make it simple and not confuse it with neighborhood parks.
Well, and to Mr. Bennett's point, I'll add on to that, that's where I come back to, and I want to say it was like Windshire, where the neighborhood was promised a park.
Right.
And it didn't go in, and then the Metro District was seeking out the town for, the
Right.
park improvement fees, and when's the park actually gonna go in that we
Right.
were promised, et cetera. I mean, that all happened in the last 4 years, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, but, I don't know, I'm sorry we're readdressing all of this
Yeah.
again, I'm coming back to why we need these, when I thought that the master plan for parks was, community parks instead of neighborhood parks, and these seem like they're still on the neighborhood park side of things.
Yeah, they are trying to fill that gap that since the town is no longer providing the neighborhood park, this is a similar amenity, smaller, but so people do have those amenities in their neighborhood. To go back to Mr. Bennett's questions on we haven't heard from development community on any concern about the proposal. And as far as the open space, so last work session in November, we did talk about the open space component, and that is a separate component from the pocket park. If town board feels the open space component is enough, then we could eliminate the pocket park requirement.
I'm not saying that, I'm just saying, the term park elicits certain images of all kinds of stuff, and that's maybe not what we're talking about exactly unless the developer chooses to put something like that in. What we're talking about, if it's an open space where people can get together a night out, those type of things, and go meet your neighbors, that's maybe a little different concept than a park per se. I don't know, I'm just playing with the words and perceptions that go with it.
Mr. Bennett and Town Board, if I could, because I think you raised a valid question, right? Are pocket parks just community parks, or the
Yeah,
neighborhood parks? If we
parks.
just reduplicated that. So if we could, for the next meeting, how about we bring back the old code and what that requirement was for the neighborhood parks? And you can compare that to what this pocket park would be, so you can see, is this really, have we just reduplicated this, and we're charging more for development? Is this a reasonable addition or not? So
I just want to make sure I'm not putting a different label on something that we
Sure,
already.
so we can do that, and then if the board thinks it's too much to bear for the development community, you can axe it or do whatever the heck you want to do. So if we could at least do that, compare that for you, can really see what the old code was and what this would be. Is that fair?
That's fair.
I like the concept. I think the concept is really good. Just to make certain we're doing it, think it through before we.
And I think the term pocket park is, it's kind of an industry standard. If in, Parks and Rec, development community, there's, people know what you're talking about. It's in terms of I mean, I think the terminology is correct with Pocket Park.
I don't know if my neighbors would understand.
Yeah.
That's
I mean,
what-
Yeah, I think
Yeah, I mean,
Parks
it
and
may not be a
Rec, I
big
think the
deal.
Parks and Rec group understand
Right,
that, but
right.
the basic layman,
Yeah.
the basic citizen out there may not, and either it sets their expectations higher,
Yeah.
or it doesn't completely maybe describe what we're really asking,
And it may not be a big.
or
deal,
what their
just think-
options might be.
Right. Just think it through.
Mayor, just to speak to that a little bit, many years ago, we had a park plan for the south side of town. It was called Pooter Park. It was kind of south of the Windsor West subdivision. And when it came time to put in the playground, the equipment, the picnic tables and all that, all the residents around it said, please don't. You know, just leave it as open space, so, you know, it's easier for us to look at. We can go out there and have a picnic now if we want to. So maybe the open space idea has some merit.
So that'll be coming back, I guess, a little bit
Yes, ma'am.
revamped.
Yes.
Okay. So item 2 is oil and gas location requirements, and I'm gonna make some apologies up front, because I got to my packet very late today, and when I read through, I was wondering where all of this came from. So I reached out at a late hour because to some of my fellow board members who felt the same way. So I appreciate a lot of the time and effort that went in here to bring us lots of information and regulations about Adams County and Broomfield and Erie, but that's not really the discussion. And I think most of the board, at least that I've talked to, I don't really care what any other community is doing or has done. Windsor's on a track to do our own thing, as we've always done before. And I think the question came up, Mr. Mayor Pro Tem Bennett brought this up, about since we were re-looking at the land use code, he wanted to specifically, I think, look at zoning and look at some of that specifically. So I want to so there's a lot of information in here, and thank you for all that information, but I don't want to necessarily go through that in that step and process. I want to try to get this back to the original conversation, and I'm going to let Mr. Bennett kind of lead where he was thinking when originally he talked about this, and how he wanted, and what he was hoping to accomplish in the conversation. So, Mr. Bennett.
It won't take long, Scott. I'm guessing some of you are responsible for me being able to drive my gasoline car here tonight. I see heads nodding, thank you. And I'm heating my house tonight with natural gas, thank you. I always point out the buttons on my shirt are made through petroleum. So I hope you believe me. My question is not about any type of criticism or attack on the industry. I have neighbors, friends, and relatives who work in the industry. I rely on it. My question, though, has been, as we look at our community and as we're growing, what do we want our neighborhoods to look like? And my question has been, why would we have industrial operations in residential neighborhoods? And it doesn't matter to me if it's oil or gas, commercial auto wash, whatever. I just feel pretty strongly that neighborhoods are not a place, or residential neighborhoods are not a place for industrial operations. So that's why I raised the question. So that's where I am on it.
Okay. So that's kind of the conversation where we kind of wanted to start that conversation. And we had asked, I believe, for a mapping of where we have current pad site locations and where in the future, though we thought those were coming, so that we even know what this conversation means.
Yeah, if I may, nothing in this memo is intended as a recommendation, with the exception of the plugged and abandoned ordinance that we wanted to talk about. And that was something new that staff included in the ordinance, or in the memo. Staff simply compiled some, well, I guess, let me step back. A lot of jurisdictions are taking a wait-and-see approach and waiting to see what the COGCC and the state adopts as far as new rulemaking that they're working through as we speak. And so the examples that were included in the memo were not intended to be examples that staff is making any recommendations about. We're simply showing you what the few jurisdictions that are moving forward, regardless of where the state is in the rulemaking process, because those were the examples that were out there as far as, draft regulations or recently adopted regulations. They weren't anything that staff is recommending approval of or that Windsor adopt. They were just for the conversation. So I guess with that, we did provide a previous map that I would need to dig that out, but the map really only showed 2 different oil and gas pads because there really isn't a lot of activity within Windsor's boundary right now. Most of the activity that you see out there is on our periphery in the unincorporated areas. I think the map that we put together.
And regardless of what we pass tonight, we wouldn't have jurisdiction in going outside of the Windsor, right?
Right. Anything we pass would apply within Windsor's corporate limits. So the active pads that we had depicted earlier were up north. We have and it's since been approved through the conditional use grant process, the Otis and Gomer pads that are on the former sports park property up north. So that was one of 2 active sites. And then the only other one in town that we were expecting or have been in review is out at the south end of Great Western Drive in the southern Great Western Industrial Park. Other than those 2.
So nothing at all, even close remotely to a residential? And
Not
I'm
at
not
this-
saying that that's not a concern,
Future,
but.
no,
but-
Yeah, not at this point in time.
Not at this point.
There are some pads that are a little closer to residential neighborhoods that are in unincorporated Weld County or Larimer County that we've seen referrals on, but they aren't anything that will go through the Windsor conditional use grant process. So,
Okay. And do you have any updates of where they stand with the current rulemaking and where that's at and what
boy,
will be some of the first or?
there are so many different rulemakings going on concurrently right now at the COGCC that I hesitate to even try and give you an accurate, I would have to pull that schedule from the COGCC website because there's just so many different rules they're working on right now that I can't pretend to keep track of all of them, so.
Okay.
Okay, Mr. Sosowski?
Thank you. Mr. Ballstead, just looking particularly, just starting with that plugged and abandoned well issue that you kind of summarized for us, thank you. It sounded like you've taken some input from the industry. I guess I really have 2 questions. One is, I'm pretty sure that COGCC, among its rulemaking, is to address requirements relating to plugged and abandoned wells. I think that's one of the areas they've identified as a new set of rules.
Staff reached out to COGCC and the 2 local operators regarding that particular item. And while they don't have anything in the rules right now regarding, because typically it's the local jurisdiction that regulates new subdivision platting or new buildings as in proximity to existing oil and gas. So I don't know if they'll have a new rule on that, but the direction that we received, or the recommendations that we received from the state and from the 2 local operators was that 150 feet would be a good minimum if you did have to get a workover rig back in there to mitigate anything with an old, plugged and abandoned well.
So the COGCC, to the extent they address it, may just be on the technical side of how to plug an abandoned well, not the setback requirement.
Right.
Obviously, we have people from the industry here, Mayor. I'm curious if we want
If they know anything up to date?
to, well, or how they feel on the 150. I think, Mr. Ballstead, you referenced 150 was industry comment.
I think I would call it maybe what they would term as a best management practice. It wasn't anything in the code yet, and I'm not aware of any COGCC discussions right now.
So we currently don't have anything?
We don't.
Okay, Mr. Wilson?
Yeah, one thing when I read the packet and based on our previous discussion, looking at the residential zoning,
throughout it, it said, no industrial operations except for oil and gas. And I think what we have, and Mr. Bennett alluded to this, was we have multiple town board members who think that exception should be removed, that maybe we shouldn't have oil and gas within a residential zone. And from my perspective, and I think Adams County did this, if you look at the packet, is you can still get to your minerals if you drill out, it'd just be surface operations. So you could drill outside the residential zone and go horizontally under it. And then in the situations where you couldn't get to your minerals, we could have a CUG or some kind of exception process. That's kind of where I thought discussion was going. And that's kind of what I would like to see happen.
Okay, Mr. Baker?
Yeah, I agree with both my colleagues. I think this has no place in residential zoning. When it comes to plug and abandon wells, if we have a 500-foot setback for an operating site, wellhead one, why wouldn't we keep that for an abandoned or no longer operating one?
Well, theoretically, and there's probably a lot more expertise in the room than myself, but after the well has been plugged and abandoned, it should be, I guess, free of any issues going forward, but there are those rare instances, and so having that buffer reduced to allow the surface owner more developable property and not, I guess, creating these really big circles of undeveloped property on the surface. Theoretically, after it's done producing, it could be reclaimed and you could reduce that.
Yeah,
That's the choice they make when they use their property for surface,
But
using
I-
that site for drilling.
Well, but I don't think there's any studies or information that actually warrants that, and I think it puts an additional restrictive barrier onto whoever owns that property to move forth and do something with it in the future.
Well, Broomfield had an explosion that's highlighted in our memo, so, and also maybe some sort of disclosure. Do people know they're buying a property within 150 feet of an abandoned well? That might be good information for a homeowner.
Well, that's what happened in Firestone, right? I mean, that was the whole Firestone debate of them
No,
putting
it wasn't an abandoned well.
It was a gas line.
gas line.
Flow lines.
Dr. Jones?
Just to go along with my colleagues, Miles and Mr. Wilson. I've sat on the board from 2000 to 2008, and then I came back on the board in 2018, but I kind of followed board activities in the interim between those terms. And there's typically public hearings when they get into the CUG process. And many residents, I can recall one incident where there was a mass turnout of residents, a lot of emotion on both sides, really, the industry and the resident side. And up until a year ago, the board just defaulted to, it's COGCC's issue, we've got to do it. There's nothing we can do about it. We can tell you what kind of shrubbery to plant around the site or how to landscape this or that, but our hands are tied. But they're not anymore. And now we have the ability to decide where, surface operations can go. And I'm on board with, I think we should not allow them in residential areas. And with the directional drilling, I don't think that's maybe necessarily a big deal, because that drilling travels miles underground. And whatever happens out in Will County, that's not our jurisdiction. We have no control over that. So that would be my 2 cents worth. I think that we can avoid a lot of public hearing. Even if we continued to allow them in residential areas, there's still going to be the public hearing process. And we go through this every time.
Well,
So
with all due respect, Dr. Jones, you weren't on the board back then, but we had a very instance of when that happened when it was going to go into residential. And because we had a large outcry from that community, actually the CUG process did work, because in that instance, the industry, the COGCC came together, and the town came together, and they all together relocated that entire site off of that property.
Well,
So,
with due
so that
respect,
can happen,
yeah.
it does happen in the process. I think those kinds of things do prevail when everybody is reasonable and listening, and in that case, it did get moved,
Well,
so,
Mayor, to that, you might add that a developer also came to the rescue, so,
yes.
on that particular project, so.
And that was outside
That may
of the
not
town.
happen every time, pardon?
It was also outside the town, so it wasn't zoned anything, it was Larimer County. So it was a pocket
So-
annexation.
Piece of property, yeah.
So does anybody know, have any updates about the rulemaking process to date, or where anything is standing? No?
Okay.
Mr. Bennett?
I'm the one that brought this up, not just me, but other people have asked the question too. I'm going to ask the reverse. Why would we allow any industrial operation in a residential area? What's the rationale for? I don't care what it is. If it's an industrial operation, why would we allow that in residentially zoned areas? What's the argument for
And do
that?
we don't allow anything currently right now?
We don't allow anything else other than oil and gas, but if we allow oil and gas, we could theoretically allow something else. So I'm just, again, looking at standards for residential areas, and I don't care what the industry is. I'm just asking if there is a argument on why we should allow industrial operations in residential zoned areas. So I'm trying to explore both sides.
Okay, yeah.
Well,
Mr.
and
Sosowski.
Mr. Bennett and I have kind of talked about this a bit
Yeah.
over coffee, but,
Yeah.
yeah, one of the distinctions, I believe, in this industry more than most, industrial, Vestas can import all of the raw materials they need to make their blades over to the industrial park where they are. The natural resource of oil and gas, however, is where it is, and you can't get it from under the ground to wherever you might want to refine it without accessing it. So I think in my mind, if you have a significant resource that you can only get by being within a certain area, and that area happens to be residential, the CUG process, to my mind, is one that in fact protects us to look at the effort, due diligence, the criteria before we would approve it. I don't know that I care either way. Right now, it says that oil and gas is permitted.
Right.
To my mind, I don't know the legislative history, if you will, of that, but I can't help but think that part of it was because it just so happened that the resource itself is in that area, and so they need to be there. You can lateral, I think, up to 2 miles, although I don't think that's ideal. But if we switched that and took that out, it would still leave it to a CUG process, where someone would say, I'm requesting to do it because that resource is down here. I can't otherwise get to it. And so now I'm asking you to give me a conditional use grant. I think you end up in the same place.
Yeah, and we have had coffee and talking about this because it's an important issue. And I absolutely respect if somebody owns rights, mineral rights, they need to have a way to get to it. I think that's going to be extremely rare. Friends I've had in the industry I've had the privilege of actually been on site in those cottages outside the wells and watched the drilling and watched the computers and everything. It's a really fascinating industry. There are technologies that allow you to go as much as 2 miles deep and 2 miles horizontal. It's more expensive, okay? And I would say that there could be a 1 or 2% chance, there might be some geographical reason that they would have to do something in it. So I'm open to some type of exclusion when there's absolutely no other way to get to your mineral rights. But I think that's going to be extremely rare and ought to be the exception, not the rule.
I think Mr.
Okay,
Parchment may be.
but I think we have somebody in the
Yeah.
industry who wants to shed some light on this, so please.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak. The question was, the most recent question was, why would you want?
Just state your name.
Oh, sorry, excuse me.
And maybe kind of like how you're connected.
Rupert Parchment, I'm actually a candidate for State Senate District 23. I'm a resident here in Windsor, Colorado. There is a oil well right in my subdivision over in Peakview. And I currently own a business where we operate in oil and gas. My truck right now is running sand right now for frac sites. So for me, this is a personal issue. This is how my family eats. I appreciate all the things you said with regards to, we all have products that are made by oil, and I'd like to also stress by safe oil operation. because we are operating safely. But you said one reason why you would want an industrial business inside a residential neighborhood. Forgive my sarcasm, but one word: jobs. How about individual property rights? How about the Constitution? How about the American dream of, I happen to sacrifice and buy a piece of land, and then there's an opportunity for me to change the welfare of my family and my neighbors and provide jobs. I think we're hostile towards energy. And I, for myself, my business now has, because I'm now selling it, because oil is pulled out, I got the call last summer like, hey, we appreciate all the work you're doing, but the work is slowing down in Colorado. Would you mind sending your trucks up to Wyoming? My trucks are in Douglas now. So jobs, and I want to be here. This is home. This is where my family is. My child was born in our home in Windsor. So a reason why I would want oil and gas or an industrial business, the gentleman here named maybe 2 or 3 locations. But otherwise, I don't see anyone bulldozing a bunch of homes in a subdivision to build a lease. As you said, hydraulic fracturing allows for us to go 2-3 miles down and then go across in multiple directions. But I just, with all due respect, I just want to make sure that our tone isn't hostile. I know we care about our neighborhoods, but this constant attack, and for me it's personal because this is my family. You know, I was gone a lot of people ask, you're in campaign mode, how come you're gone? I was up there up in Wyoming, training new employees, taking care of my trucks because my business has been displaced because of this. So let's please take this into account when we think about our neighbors. That's another word, because if oil and gas is gone, safe oil and gas, we're going to lose a lot of our neighbors. And then the question won't be, why would we want an industrial business in our subdivision, but what's going on with all these vacancies and the foreclosures? And how do we pay for some of this infrastructure because our tax base is gone? So please consider that. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. McCarty? I just have a question about the connection that he brought up about how does Senate Bill, I mean, if we were to pass something like this, we have Senate Bill 181, but we also have the protected Constitution rights. And if we were to have that, and if somebody said, but I still want to have access to my rights, and for whatever reason, this directional or whatever would not work, what supersedes?
I can't answer that question. It's not been tested yet. I understand that there are folks who are studying whether the powers of 181 actually do deprive somebody of a constitutionally protected interest. I would say at this time, it's hard to say because we don't know what the policy is. I think what Adams County has done, for example, and what you've described here, is the idea that if a property right cannot be exploited in any other manner, then you seek an exception. That hasn't been tested either, but that's certainly an alternative to saying that you can't exercise your property rights to get to the minerals. Senate Bill 181 has not been tested in the courts yet. You are on the cutting edge of legal authority that the legislature has given to you.
Okay. Mr. Baker?
Yeah, we don't normally take public comment in a work session, so I'd like, if we're going to, we should open it up to all parties.
He was recognized as an industry, somebody related to the industry,
Okay.
not just a citizen. He works in the industry.
Are there any residents that want to speak up?
I'm the person who gets to make that call, Mr. Wilson.
So you're
and that
going
is
to
not
allow
your-
some people to speak, but not
I said I
others?
would allow people in the industry. People
That's
who
what I'm
are
saying.
related, so if there's somebody who's related, who works in the industry, who wishes to come forward on the board, such as Mr. Parchment does, then at that time I would
So
entertain
you're
that.
allowing somebody from the industry, but not a resident to speak?
I would not
You're
select-
only hearing one side.
We are taking comment from experts who work in the industry to give us more information for consideration.
Sounds biased.
And I don't know that a person who just is living in a residence. So, yes, I would not take that comment at this time.
Madam Mayor, I just have one comment. From what I hear here, I don't think there's any kind of hostility towards the industry. And I don't think we want to restrict jobs. I don't think anyone up here wants to restrict anybody's access to their mineral rights. And what I'm hearing is at least 4 individuals on the board that are interested in pursuing removing oil and gas operations, surface operations from residential zoning. So with that majority, where do we go from here?
Well, I'm the one that,
It's not a vote.
yeah, it's not a vote. We can't vote in this meeting. This is for a conversation and to take information. And so, while I agree that we don't want the industry in the backyard of our neighbors, I don't even think the industry wants to be in the backyard of our neighbors. The thing that I want to be careful about before we just blatantly pass land use code, and I see to your point, Mr. Bennett, about residential, but how many times do we have current residential that, and we've seen this time and time again, where a developer has slated it residential, and then as over time and as things change, they've come back and they wanted to rezone that to become something else. We've seen lots of that in the last couple of years, where a residential has become multi-use because they needed to add additional pieces to make it work in the current climate conditions. And so what I want to make sure doesn't happen is if we all of a sudden restrict this when we say residential, and then we prevent somebody in the future from being able to rezone, because then you'll have people who will be resistant to rezoning because they'll want to keep that rezoning in place.
But that would be up
So-
to the board.
But so I think that this thing has to be maybe very carefully thought out and looked at.
Madam Mayor.
Yes, Mr. Redemeyer.
I don't know if this is a question for the industry or for Mr. McCarter. According to Senate Bill 181, they have until when to implement? Wasn't it like a year and a half after it was passed? Wasn't it 18 months or something? Because I know that that's one of the questions that we've talked about is 181 going to impose certain things that would take state governance over local municipalities based upon what, what the COGCC was going to do? I mean, that's one of the questions that we've had before we started changing CUG language, et cetera. And do we know that when not trying to kick the ball, but my question is, at what point are we going to know this is what they've determined, this is what takes precedence, and then local municipalities can alter that or not? Do we know what that is?
I'm not very good at answering questions tonight, I guess. The answer is that the legislation gives the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission and the Department of Health what could be up to 18 months to come up with rulemaking, to complete the rulemaking process. So we've got the legislation in place, but the legislation commands those state agencies to conduct rulemaking on a number of different topics. So and we all know that those things are going on. But as far as what they're going to decide and when, I can't answer that. I don't know.
Yeah,
Mr.
Mr. McCarter,
Sisaki.
the only strict timetable I can recall in 181 is the shift from the current board commission to the professional commission, and that had a specific timeline. But I believe the rulemaking itself could just continue. They have proposed timelines on their website, estimates of when they might reach rulemaking on certain issues, but I don't believe there's a hard deadline like.
There are targets
Yeah.
for that. I would say targets.
When are you wrapping up the land use code update? Or where are you at in the middle of that, of the process?
Well, we were hoping that we could schedule what Paul went over tonight separately and get that, because this board is familiar with it and has discussed it at several work sessions. We were hoping to move that forward and get at least the streamlining of the land use processes approved and in the code. Concurrently, we were trying to address the land use location of oil and gas, but as a separate item so that it didn't, I guess, get bogged down, either topic get bogged down on, but for one topic.
Because you're looking at all kinds of other things too, right? This is just
Yeah, it's
one
a-
piece of that puzzle, so.
Yeah, it's a huge undertaking to update 3 chapters in the municipal code. And so the land use code is we were hoping to take what Paul had tonight and get
But we
it
can
before
still
you
move
soon.
forward with that. I mean, you've got direction to move forward with that.
Yeah.
This piece doesn't have to be decided. There's not an emergency or an air of, so I think, we can. And we still have the air quality conversation that's coming next Monday.
Right.
That I think is an important conversation. So we need to hear from those folks as well before we, make decisions.
Right. Yeah, the information in tonight's packet was simply for town board
For
to
information.
digest and discuss and give staff other direction as to what additional information you want us to bring back.
Okay? Mr. Baker?
So is
and then
this
Mr. Soslowski.
a land code update? Or is this a rewrite of the land code?
What Paul went over is a comprehensive update of the land use code. I would characterize the oil and gas discussion as one aspect of land use, and so we typically, it's very common for us to change one section of the code independent of a larger update. For example, the parking in the front yard code that Paul mentioned earlier is something that if we weren't doing a larger code update right now, we would probably bring that as a standalone ordinance, just to address the one issue that we are getting some complaints
I'm
on.
guessing this is a pretty important piece of that update, though, this oil and gas in residential zoning. And to Mr. Wilson's point, it sounds like there's at least 4 of us that are interested in that piece, so I would support doing it all together, I think.
I would as well.
Mayor?
Mr. Soslowski?
Thank you. And actually, okay.
Okay.
I think that it's, first of all, I think the issue came up because part of the land use code you're looking at is one that currently says residential areas, no industrial except for oil and gas, is my impression.
Actually, I think it came up because of Senate Bill 181. We really weren't,
Yeah, it was when we did the
No,
last
it
work
was-
session,
it was raised, but we had staff in the larger code update that we started with a third-party consultant over a year ago. We hadn't envisioned any changes with regard to the oil and gas process because at that time, we were still under the state law that our purview was limited. So I think once Senate Bill 181 was passed, the conversation kind of changed, and that's where it kind of has been incorporated into
right.
the.
Well, and I would just say, Mr. Bennett brought it up, so when we did the last land use code,
Right.
I think he brought it up in light of 181. So it's kind of, it was part of the code updates, and then the question was, well, why aren't we addressing this? And so that's why staff wanted to bring this conversation separately, because again, it's, the board decides if they're married or.
Right.
You want to go first?
Yeah, if I can just kind of finish thinking, because it seemed to me you were bringing up a fairly narrow issue, but one that is in the land use code, and that relates to the current carve-out within residential zoning to allow for oil and gas, why allow industrial? And I don't know whether you need to address that now, but certainly here we are discussing it. I'm curious, and Ms. McCarr, I'd almost take your analysis on this. So currently it says residential areas can have no industry except for oil and gas, which I assume then means, but subject to is CUG analysis with all the criteria that go along with that CUG process. But if you carve that out and said instead, no industrial and residential area provided, oil and gas is permissible if they can't otherwise access, subject to the CUG process, don't you end up in the same place? Where you're doing an ad hoc review of a particular request for an industrial use, with the difference being simply you have to show you can't otherwise access your raw material. I'm not sure if there's some sort of inherent bias because it's in the code or not in the code, you still end up with the CUG process.
You wind up with the CUG process in more limited cases, I would assume. That you have situations where somebody can otherwise get to their minerals outside of a residential area. You'd never see those CUGs. And in the instance where someone claims to not be able to get to the minerals but for a site in a residential area, then you have criteria set up for that. Those are built into your Senate Bill 181 powers. And you're right, you will see CUGs, but you won't see them the way you have been, which is a public hearing on landscaping, essentially.
Right.
And
Yeah.
Senate Bill 181 gives you greater power if that's the will of the board.
So am I hearing you say that we could still, the process still, in these exceptions, it would still automate a CUG in the process? We wouldn't have to dictate that in the code?
You would build it into the code and
We'd
you
have
would
to
make,
build it
so
into the
you would have a rule that it can't take place in a residential area, but you would have an exception to the rule in those cases where someone can demonstrate that they can't get to the minerals other than through a residential drilling site.
So there's the burden of proof.
Yeah, I
before you
think,
trigger.
is that what Mr. Baker even said? Did you said something
did
like
that.
that, didn't you?
You said
in
that.
your
I've
comment?
said,
Initially,
before I've
you
said
it?
that,
Okay.
Mr. Wilson said it.
Okay, Mr. Bennett.
I would strongly support a process like you just described, because there could be situations where they have no other way of getting to their mineral rights, and there needs to be flexibility. And so, hard, fast rules generally get us in trouble. This question came up for me when we did look at that land use code, and it stood out in every zone that, and again, for me, it's not just oil and gas, it's any industrial operation, residential. I am okay separating it because there's some things in the land use code update that I think are really good, like the grid pattern will improve our traffic flow. Smaller lots might improve some of our housing situation. So I would be in favor of separating any question about industrial operations and residential as a separate topic, if we can come back to it with more information perhaps. And the other things that are being suggested in the land use code I think are good, and I think I'd like to see us move forward on those as soon as possible.
Yeah, I think what's important too is to get that map back in front of us so we
Yes.
can see
Yes.
where what we have already, what's coming, so we can even see like how big of an issue this might be.
Right.
I agree with Mr. Bennett about looking at this flexibility
Yeah.
and perhaps having this, what it was, certain clause in there that would, if they could not. But I do want to speak to the point about why I'm not allowing just public testimony. We will eventually, at some point, have a public hearing, and that would be the public's opportunity to come forward if we, or if we go through a process and we have a second reading. That would be another process, because what I said and stated at the very beginning of this is that I would take industry experts, and I'm not just going to take anybody from the public, because it's the same thing as that I sit on the Mental Health Advisory Board. If I am making, and everybody has, I'm sure, you all have a feeling or a thought or pros or cons about the mental health industry right now, right? But if I'm making a decision about what needs to happen with the mental health industry, I'm not going to listen just to the public at large to get my advice to make that decision. I need to listen to industry experts who work in that field, who understand, who can drive the discussions. Not just people who are reading stuff online or who have other thoughts, and not that those aren't important other things that we need to hear, but at the most appropriate time. And this is the time when we're supposed to be getting information to base our next steps and our next processes on. And that's why we need to rely on information that we bring from that our staff brings forward. And that's why I said I would allow industry experts. And Mr. Rupert recognized himself as an industry expert, and I do know that he does work in that field. So I just wanted to make that claim. So what I heard was from Mr. Bennett was to move forward with the first phase of the stuff that we saw tonight, and then we see some options to kind of move forward with the secondary piece, breaking that out separatally in terms
I'm
of
not sure everybody's on the page with that.
the residential.
Well, if we break that up, what's the timeline on the part two, let's say? Location of oil and gas.
Well, we do have another conversation next Monday on the air quality conversation.
And Dr. Jones, we can look at the future meetings agenda, and again, just staff it sounds like you've had the Board of Those obviously had a good conversation about what you saw. It seems like maybe there's a little bit more inclination to consider a change that would say, not allowed in residential, but for if it can't be accessed in any other way, there would still be a conditional use process. So I don't know that all 7 people agree with that, but it seems like maybe that's the thing that came up most often that I heard from the board. But I don't know really what we bring back right now unless we kind of had direction of, let us see this. You know, I did hear from the mayor that she'd like to see that oil and gas well map, so we can certainly provide that. But I don't think there'd be a whole lot more work for staff right now because the board's just kind of discussing what I'd like to see. So we could bring that back probably fairly quickly. We can look at the future meeting agenda and see what's free and schedule it tonight if you like.
Okay. Okay, Mr. Sislowski, then Mr. Baker, and then Mr. Rennemeyer.
Thank you, Mayor. I guess I would caution, I guess not even caution, I think I've been somewhat consistent in my approach that if the COGCC has a set of rules, if they have a guideline under which they have to develop a bunch of rules, but under 181, one of those, in fact, is to say, under 181, local governments have all these land use decisions that they can make, but oh, by the way, in terms of location, if you choose not to, you can appeal to COGCC for location analysis and consultation with their experts. And I continue to wonder why we don't use that as a resource when we're thinking through locational issues, since these people probably know a lot more than anyone in this room, let alone just people who work in the industry. So on location analysis, I guess, again, I would caution us to keep in mind that the COGCC will not only develop their rules, but they will provide a resource for us to advise and advise with respect to locational issues.
Yeah, that's a good reminder. Are you finished?
Yes, thank
Mr. Baker?
Well, I still believe it should be, they need to be married, these issues, and it sounds like we're really close in some sort of agreement where we could, I think Mr. Hale said, it sounds like if we put this off 2 or 3 weeks, maybe it feels like we're close enough on some sort of, it's not allowed in residential except for the CUG appeal process, so I'm not sure we need to separate them at this point. I felt like we were pretty close on some sort of consensus in that.
Okay, Mr.
And
Ballstead?
if I could ask clarification, just the CUG appeal process kind of implies that we wouldn't require a CUG in some instances, but right now, the code does require a CUG for all oil and gas. So
This was only in residential areas. Otherwise, non-residential, you'd fall under the current scheme.
Under the current
Which
stand.
is a
Yeah,
CUG.
I don't think anybody's
Right.
recommending to change from that.
I think what I heard is maybe kind of the Adams County model, so in residential, it's not allowed unless they appeal and say,
Okay.
look, we can't access it, we have no way, we
Right,
can't
okay.
bore that far, and then it'd be a process in front of the board.
Okay.
Okay, Mr. Rennemeyer?
Well, my question was, again, what's this map? Is it existing? Is it future? Is it what's pending with COGCC? Because when we've had a lot of different numbers thrown out there as far as how few have been getting approved through the COGCC since 181 passed. So my question is, do we have any way to know what the industry would do if we were still pre-181? You know, like, I mean, we're trying to make these standards, but we say we've only got 2 or 3 pads in town. I guess that's my question is what are we trying to, you know, like what's the intent of the industry within the town right now? Is that part of the map? What's the map? That's what I'm saying. What did the map say again? Because have we ever seen a map? Was it a revised map?
Staff prepared a map for one of the previous work sessions to identify those locations that are being proposed within Windsor's corporate limits. And there were only 2 pads proposed at that time, or 3, 2 right next to each other. Those have since been approved. I believe the one in Great Western Industrial Park is the only one that would show up on a map of new, I guess, oil and gas proposals we're expecting within our corporate limits. I can certainly pull together, the COGCC GIS website has every permitted well depicted on it. That is depicted every well back to the 70s and before. So it does look a lot busier than what activity levels in town are right now, because it just shows all those historical wells. But I could certainly provide that map, a map showing the one pad that we expect, and then we've got our wing map that shows all of the pads that we've approved over the last 15 years. I mean, if that's what would be helpful.
Okay, Mr. Baker?
The map doesn't show what might come 6 months from now that we don't know, right? I mean,
No, that's
we have a whole
really,
growth management area, we have,
yeah, that's up to individual operators and their plans and the
Yeah.
market and all of those different
technology changes and their
forces,
plans
right.
may change.
Right. You know, I'm aware of some pads that are on our periphery in unincorporated areas, but I'd hate to try and map something that's prospective and may or may not come to fruition.
But new technologies may open up our town to something new. We don't know.
Right.
God, would these maps show what's sited outside of our corporate limits? What is, the explorations taking place within city limits?
We can make those maps. It's going to be really busy because it shows the whole 2 miles of the directional drill. And so you start seeing all of those for an area the size of Windsor's corporate limits. And it's pretty tough to decipher unless you're very active and looking at that stuff all the time. We could certainly put one together. I'm just forewarning that you may not, I don't know what
Not being able to make sense
benefit
out
it
of
would be,
something.
yeah. But I can certainly do that.
Yeah, and so is there information that the board would find helpful? I mean, is like active pads in town, is that helpful or not? Is, ones we know of, I mean, really, again, like Mr. Paul said, I think industry folks may have an eye or a plan of where they want to go, but that's proprietary on their end, and we don't have that.
Okay, that was kind of where I was
Yeah.
headed with, yeah.
Unless there's something that has been identified that's going through the process, I mean, that's what I'd like to see. is
Yeah.
What do we have, what do we know, what's coming through?
Yeah, that map that I keep referring to, the way we put it together was simply contacting the most active 2 operators, and those were the only 2 at that time. And so I could follow up with them again, but again, the plan is fluid.
And maybe on that map, under current zoning, I mean, identify specifically the residential,
Okay?
so that we know what we're
That's why
talking
I was going to
about.
look at our zoning map. Because we're projected to grow quite a bit in the next
Right.
couple of decades, so I was going to look at the map of our current zoning areas. Because that would be areas where we would have residential.
Right.
And so when you are talking residential, are you only talking, so only residential zoning, not multi-use? Because that does include a piece
It
of
does,
residential.
it does,
So
yeah.
again,
And I have
that's
questions
why
about
there,
that,
that
yeah.
kind of
Right,
starts
right.
moving into
Yeah,
bigger,
right.
areas and additional
Yeah.
conversation,
Right.
I think, so. Mr. Sisowski.
And I think, Shane, to your question, I think if there's other information we would like to see, I'd like to see a little more thorough analysis or information in the industry about the 2-mile lateral, or is it 3, or is it 1.5 before it's not commercially reasonable or pragmatic? So we're kind of in our heads thinking, we've all heard 2 miles, but you may talk to somebody in the industry who says, well, technically yes, but pragmatically no. I don't know what that limit is. So I'm curious, anything you could find out specific?
Okay. Anything else?
Just say on this topic, for those of you who took the time to come out this evening, I'm going to hang around afterwards and be glad to listen to any of your opinions and comments.
You buy?
Yeah, I'll buy.
I'm there.
You'll be there.
Follow up. Anything else you want to instruct our town manager? So, and we'll look at a future date, because next week, we only have an hour, and we've already got 3 folks that we know that are going to be coming to talk to us. We've got somebody, I believe, from Great Western, from Extraction, and from Western States Security,
I think that's right.
coming to talk to us about air quality monitoring and what they know of that process to date, or what they're doing to date.
Right, and so Mayor, if the board does want to look on page 580, and I'm sorry for the size of the pack, but if you look on page 580, we do have our future town board meeting.
Yep.
So you can see we've got pretty filled agendas going into March. So if there's something that you'd like us to table or move around, we can certainly do that. That's the board's prerogative if you want to hear discussion at a different time. So I'm certainly open to that, but you can kind of see, it looks like, you know, this could come back March 2nd, you know, we've got the strategic plan draft presentation, but we could, you know, we would have a longer night. We're not limited to 1 hour on that. Or we have the March 9th board manager attorney monthly meeting, but that's normally just an hour, so I don't know if that's enough time to bring this back or not.
How does that work with planning and where they're
Oh,
headed with
that's-
trying to?
What is that?
Yeah, never mind, that's the NLC one, so.
That's in there somewhere.
They're okay?
Yeah.
With, if we
One of the
get back to
regular
this
meeting
in March, that piece, this piece?
We'll,
doesn't-
we'll work with the schedule that you've got. So
Yeah.
as long as we can keep the transportation master plan on its schedule, I'd hate to derail that, so.
Okay. Okay. If I don't see anything else or any direction from Mr. Shane, our town work session is adjourned. Thank you.
When is going to League of Cities? Which meeting is that?
Pulled or not pulled.